Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Terry Boardman.
Good evening. Hello, nice to be with you again. Can everybody hear me okay? The back?
Yes.
Yeah? If it just goes down, just please raise your hand. Rob's introductions, every time I come there getting really feeling getting quite pumped up here. Thanks very much, Rob. It's always interesting, I don't know if you've noticed how often there's something, some little thing, it might only be a little thing, but something very noteworthy happens when you look back at your day, at the end of the day, and you look back at the day you've just gone through. Something special, it might only be very, very small. But just give you an illustration of something like that to me, because when these things happen, you look back at that, then you begin to realize, oh, it seems like there's some sort of meaning in the things I'm going through in my life, even if they might be tough. And for example, today, as you can see, I'm going to talk about America and China. It took 3 trains to get here from Stourbridge in the West Midlands. It's a pleasant journey. The first train I got on, I was at one end, and at the other end were a bunch of teenagers. And the girls were singing, because they had their, they had their headphones, what do you call them these days? In my day it was headphones, Walkmans and all, the headsets, yeah? They had their earplugs in, and they were singing along to them, you see. But of course not really caring about anybody else who was in the carriage. So quite loud. And I couldn't help thinking, well, 40 years ago that wouldn't have happened, but maybe that's just me getting older. And then I couldn't help noticing also the song that one of the girls was singing very loudly. And I could just hear this refrain. It was a very American, transatlantic style song. And the words that she kept repeating over and over, it's all about me. It's all about me. Yeah? This is the repeated tune over and over. It's all about me. Fortunately, I didn't have to put up with that too long, because I got off after about 3 stops. That was the first train I was on. And then I changed trains in Wolverhampton, got on the next train, and the compartment I was in, there was a Chinese family in. Now, I happen to know the difference between Mandarin and Cantonese, so I recognise this as Cantonese from Hong Kong. And these people it was a family, about 6 of them, and they were really going at it in a really energetic conversation. And again, the carriage was about half full, I suppose, with other people. And there again, they didn't seem to be paying attention to, oh, perhaps we better keep our voices down, But they were just going at it really loud, as energetic Hong Kong people can. And I thought, well, that's interesting. They're doing their family thing. They're in a kind of family bubble. And they're really not paying attention to anything outside this family bubble. Whereas the young girl who was singing the song, the American-sounding song, she was in her kind of teenage tribal bubble, if you will. But of course, that's a different kind of bubble, because the family bubble is based on blood. It's based on genetics. But the teenage bubble is not really based on that. It's based on just being a teenager, belonging to that particular tribe. And it's based on the attempt to assert yourself. This awkward state you're in as a teenager. You're half in the group, and at the same time you're trying to get out of the group. So you're trying to find yourself, but at the same time you don't want to abandon your peers. I just thought that was very interesting, that just on the day when I happened to be coming up here to give this talk about America and China, that I find myself on these 2 trains. On the 3rd train, not quite so direct a connection, but there, I was sitting opposite a small English family, and here, well, it's one of these sad occasions where, unfortunately, the father couldn't speak to his daughter, who was only about 2 or 3, without shouting at her. So it was, sit! Now! This kind of thing. I'm sure you've come across them. Stop messing about! This sort of language to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. In other words, the father And he wasn't like that all the time. I don't want to give the wrong impression. Sometimes he gave her a kiss and cuddle. But when she got out of line even a bit, don't touch my arm! You know, he was trying to do crosswords and something that looked like Sudoku or something, or some sort of word game or something like that. Wasn't really interested in playing with his daughter. She was only 2 or 3. So when she touched so I told you not to touch my arm! You know, really loud. And I felt sad. Because here was a father, for whatever reason, he didn't realise that you can't actually talk to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. I mean, his daughter could, she could speak, but obviously she was still in the process of learning to speak. So it was as if the father was speaking to his daughter as if she was, say, 6, 7, 8, as if she was an ego being already, as if she had a self. So the father hadn't reckoned that his daughter was a kind of growing, evolving being, and that you can't actually speak to a 2 or 3-year-old, or you shouldn't, in the way that you speak to, say, a 5 or 6 or a 10-year-old. And that was an interesting experience too. This question of not understanding, not feeling how a child grows, the process of evolution, as it were, of the soul that the child goes through, and what's necessary or good to do at each stage of that development. So that was my experience as I came up today. Now the reason why I've chosen this topic to talk to you about tonight is because the thing that took me into the whole field of alternative history and, if you like, conspiracies and all of that was my big interest since childhood in the First World War. And understanding how the First World War was really, in a sense, that's what started the 20th century, into which I was born, in which all of you were born. The 20th century, what was it about? And it started in 1914 with the First World War. Before 1914, in a sense, we were still in the 19th century in many respects. At the end of the First World War, we're in a new world already. Of course, you could say some things haven't changed, we still have the class system, and so on and so forth, but I'm sure you understand what I mean. Many, many things have changed. I don't have time to go through all of those by now. But it was a profound change, right across, well, all the societies that went through that experience, and some that didn't. So, when I started looking at what was happening in Europe, say from 1910 to 1914, then at certain points I started realizing we seem to be in a rather similar situation now, and it's rather worrying. And I'd like to speak about some of those points and why the relationship between then and now is so strong. Because I'm certainly not the only person who thinks so. Many of the American policymakers, think tankers, commentators, people in the military are thinking the same thing. They're looking at China and they're seeing Germany 1910, Germany 1900s. They're looking, here's the threat, here's the danger. How can we protect ourselves against this? How can we encircle Germany? How can we keep it under control? How can we do the same with China? And we all know what that led to. Because obviously if you focus on something hard enough, sometimes it actually comes about. And if you plan for a war, it can come about. So, without further ado, America and China then. Just first a few observations about the present situation. Yeah? We've seen how in recent years America's fear of China has gradually increased, since I would say about 1995, their mid-90s. And, well, here you see, for example, the symbol of China, the panda, on the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building. Because the Economist never does anything without extreme consciousness. Yeah? It's a very, very... whenever I give a talk, I always recommend people to read The Economist. Because if you want to understand what the powers that be are planning and thinking and how they operate, I think The Economist is a very good guide to that. So it's not an accident, therefore, that it's the Empire State Building that the panda's climbing up. But of course, in the movie, back in, when was it, the early 30s, it wasn't a panda, it was a giant gorilla, so King Kong. So the implication, the subtext here is, and King Kong was like almost like a prehistoric movie from ancient times, yes? Sorry, a prehistoric monster. So the subtext here is that the Chinese are also ancient monsters from ancient times, climbing up our empire. And we see the military aircraft in the background waiting to strike. And then here we have the odd couple, Uncle Sam and Mao. And you see which one looks happier. It's clearly Mao has got this sort of almost stereotypical Asian, inscrutable, serene attitude, smile, half smile on his face, whereas Uncle Sam is looking very perturbed, to say the least. But they've both got all these weapons here. Don't know if you can see that at the back: baseball bat, grenade, revolver, rocket launcher, machine gun. However, here in the middle between them, one of them has placed a rose. And from the angle that the rose is pointing, I would say it's probably Mao, but who knows? What could that mean? The odd couple. So this is 2009, so of course by this time America and China are almost symbiotically related economically. And so they're in bed together. We're not quite sure who is, forgive me, screwing who. But, you know, they certainly have a kind of a sexual relationship, you could say. Financio-sexual relationship. But it's not a comfortable one. Not at all. Sorry, Albert?
Not enough blasphemy.
I didn't say that. But if we pass on from these, we see that a certain change takes place as we go further on into the last decade. You see? So now we're in 2010. But already you can see things have changed a bit. Now the mood of fear and aggression has developed much stronger. So we have poor little Barack Obama here being supposedly threatened by the Chinese dragon.
That can only be a good thing.
Facing up to China. And then here we have a young Chinese soldier peering through a gun sight. At whom? Well, again, the obvious implication is he's peering at Uncle Sam and the West in general. So gradually the elite media world has been slowly and steadily ratcheting up the paranoia. And this was, again, exactly what happened between England and Germany between 1895 actually. 1895-96, when things were getting hot in South Africa, until 1914. There was a steady ratcheting up of incredible scaremongering, saber-rattling, anti-German paranoia in this country. A little bit in Germany, but nowhere near as strong as in Britain. Now, of course, the Chinese, from their side, they have a lot to be resentful about when it comes to the West. I'm sure you've probably come across this phrase, if you've come across anything to do with China, the so-called century of humiliation, which started with the Opium Wars. And here we see a sign, again, from about 100 years ago, with the either dead or half-dead dragon here, and then Russia, the Russian bear, the British lion, the German eagle, the American eagle, Japanese cat, Italian hyena or dog or whatever this is, arguing over it. And of course, 100 years ago, in 1900, when that century started, all the Western imperial nations actually went into Beijing in order to sort out the so-called Boxer Rebellion. The rebellion of the Boxer martial arts cult, who were ferociously anti-foreign. And they wanted all the foreigners out of China. The foreigners didn't take too well to that. So after a few priests and missionaries were killed and a few other Westerners by these martial artists who were pretty ferocious, they sent in an 8-nation expeditionary force. The first time where you could say what's going on in Afghanistan and in Iraq and Libya, where all Western powers gang up on some non-white, non-Western country that can hardly defend itself. Well, that was China in those days. So that had happened after 60 years of oppression, largely from, it has to be said, Britain. Starting, of course, with the Opium War. Here, on the right, we see Lord Elgin, of Lord Elgin Marvel's fame, who in 1860, in the Second Opium War, went into China and at the end of that war totally destroyed the Summer Palace in Beijing, which is a vast area of the Summer Palace, a very, very beautiful place, which only for the emperors used. And part of this Summer Palace was was designed, I should say, was designed by the Jesuits. Now, that's very interesting. I'll come to that later on. It was designed by the Jesuits in the 18th century. But the whole thing was a very beautiful place. Today, the only thing that exists are the ruins of those Western-style Jesuit-designed buildings. The Chinese wooden buildings were, of course, all burned down. But it's interesting just to note, you see, apart from the fact that the Chinaman is shown as an absolutely repulsive dragon here, not at all an interesting or attractive-looking dragon, but Lord Elgin, of course, the Brit, you see, is dressed as a Greek, which is how the upper classes in those days saw themselves, public school boys all. And look what he's carrying here, what a strange implement, yeah?
2 big balls.
2 big balls, right. A stick and 2 big balls, yeah? And there was a lot in those days of sort of suppressed sexuality in the art that the upper classes liked to use and look at. But you could also perhaps look at these 2 balls as 2 hemispheres. And this is what he's using to smash the Chinaman here. This is called What We Ought to Do in China. Punch magazine. Punch. 1860. How things have changed, how non-PC by our standards today. This is America, again about 100 years ago, and in those days a lot of the American railways were built by a lot of navvies who came over from China, coolies as they called them. And without the Chinese coolies, many of the American railways wouldn't have been built. But the Americans weren't too keen on the coolies staying any longer. So the point was, we forget about equal rights and country of immigrants and all these things we hear so much about, so we kicked them out, and there was a lot of prejudice and so on. All these things went down, as you can imagine, very badly in China. So it was not only how the Westerners behaved to Chinese in their own country, but also what they did in China itself. Starting with the Opium Wars. And this led to this century of humiliation, which really only ended when Mao came to power in 1949. And as Rob said, I mean, I taught, actually it wasn't so much children, but Chinese young people at Dudley College of Technology. Many of these people, these young Chinese between the ages of about 16 and 26, were sons and daughters of the present Chinese business class. So they come over here to study English and then go on to, say, Birmingham University, do a business degree or whatever, and then go back and help the family business. This kind of thing, typical profile. And it was interesting for me to interact with these people and to hear how they perceived relations between East and West and their own government and so on, and to see the extent of the programming and the nationalist brainwashing which is clearly going on in China. And one of the things they almost always brought up, would you believe, was the burning of the Summer Palace by the Brits. Now you see, because in our schools we're only taught about the Tudors and the Nazis, apparently, these days,